According to Omar Bradley, this World War II veteran who stormed to the beaches of Normandy during the first wave on D-Day displayed the single most heroic action he had ever seen in combat. Today we are talking about Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Yes, that Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States. Now, when you are the son of a famous, larger-than-life U.S. President, you have a lot of expectations on your shoulders. Most people in that situation elect to fly under the radar and do their best to try and stay out of the limelight. But for Theodore Roosevelt Jr., he decided to fly in the other direction. He made a name for himself during World War I and after the war as a politician. But it was during World War II that he became a legend. His father would become a war hero and a legend in his own right during the Spanish-American War as a lieutenant colonel and leader of the Rough Rider Regiment, prior to becoming the youngest president in U.S. history at 42 years of age. Roosevelt Jr.'s military service is lesser known than that of his father's, but one could make the argument that it's more distinguished. He is the former president's first son and was born in New York City on September 13th, 1887. As you might expect, he grew up under the significant influence of his father, who had high expectations for his firstborn. With hopes of pursuing a career in banking and publishing, he attended only the best schools, which included Harvard, which he graduated from in 1909. But he was inspired deeply by his famous father's military exploits, so Jr. decided to follow in his footsteps. Now, prior to World War I, all of President Roosevelt's sons received some level of military training. Shortly after the United States declared war on Germany, former President Roosevelt wired the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, Major General John Blackjack Pershing, asking if his sons could accompany him in Europe as privates. Pershing agreed, but rather than privates, he offered Theodore a commission and a rank of major. I guess being the son of a former president does have its perks. Major Roosevelt volunteered to go to the Western Front and would be one of the first American soldiers to do so. Now, conditions there were, well, to put it bluntly, miserable. I mean, war is miserable in general, but the fighting on the Western Front during World War I was on another level. Soldiers lived in muddy, waterlogged trenches that were breeding grounds for diseases and infestations. They faced constant threats from artillery shelling, snipers, and the ever-present danger of death. Long periods of boredom were punctuated by brief moments of sheer terror. Rats, lice, and other pests tormented the troops relentlessly. And not only were the Germans a threat, but the soldiers had to worry about trench foot, trench fever, and dysentery. Oh, and we can't forget about the mustard gas attacks. Yeah, trench warfare during the First World War was bad, really bad, and it has rightfully been described as nightmarish. While serving in those hellish conditions, Major Roosevelt was recognized as the best battalion commander in his division. He braved all the conditions we just mentioned to lead his men. And as any good commander does, he was constantly thinking of their welfare. So much so that he purchased combat boots for his entire battalion at his own cost. Now a lieutenant colonel, Roosevelt was in command of the 26th Regiment when he was gassed and wounded. He received the Distinguished Service Cross as well as the National Order of the Legion of Honor from the French. And prior to the troops returning home, Roosevelt, along with several other officers, was instrumental in the creation of the American Legion. Now, between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was a busy man. In addition to continuing to serve in the reserves, he was elected to the New York State Assembly. And in 1921, he was appointed by President Warren G. Harding as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And then in 1929, he was appointed to be the governor of Puerto Rico by President Herbert Hoover. Now, coming off several successes in the PR, he was appointed by Hoover as the Governor General of the Philippines in 1932. And it was while in the Philippines that he was given an interesting nickname. The Filipinos started calling him One-Shot Teddy. And why, you might ask? Because of his marksmanship during a hunt for wild pygmy water buffalo. I literally have never heard of that. Upon returning from the Philippines, Roosevelt got into publishing, serving as the vice president of Doubleday, Doran and Company, and then as an executive with American Express. And in 1940, Roosevelt attended military refresher training and was promoted to full bird colonel. He returned to active duty in the spring of 1941 and was given command of his old infantry division from World War I, the 26th. And by late 1941, he was promoted to brigadier general. Now, as a general, you can stay back behind the lines where it's safer. But that wasn't who Roosevelt was. He much preferred the heat of battle to the comfort of a command post. So he often visited the front lines, which endeared him to his men. While commanding the 26th Infantry, he took part in the invasion of North Africa and then would become the assistant division commander of the 1st Infantry Division. It was there that he would clash with another famous hard-charging general, George S. Patton. You see, Patton was a by-the-book officer. He was not fond of an unorthodox approach to warfare, and he expected his officers to dress appropriately, meaning in their regulation uniforms with spit-shine boots. General Roosevelt placed little value on that way of thinking, and Patton didn't like it. Roosevelt's ways were also criticized by General Omar Bradley, who thought that Roosevelt, quote, loved his division too much. Bradley thought that this was bad for discipline, and as a result of being on the bad side of both generals, Roosevelt was relieved of his command by General Bradley. And Bradley would later write in his autobiographies that relieving Roosevelt was one of the most unpleasant duties of the war. Now, as if Roosevelt's life and achievements aren't impressive enough at this point, they are about to take a turn towards legendary status. In preparations for the Normandy invasion, General Roosevelt was assigned to England and appointed Deputy Division Commander of the 4th Infantry Division. It was the 4th ID that would be tasked with landing at Utah Beach on D-Day, becoming the first Allied units to hit the beaches on June 6, 1944. And aside from the 82nd Airborne, who parachuted in earlier that day, the 4th ID would be the first boots on the ground. And General Roosevelt had every intention of being right there with them. Roosevelt made several verbal requests to the division's commander, Major General Raymond Barton, to go ashore with the first wave, and each was denied. He then put his request in writing. General Roosevelt made the case that the success of D-Day will in part be determined by the success of the first elements to hit the beach. He made the argument that accurate information as to what was going on the beach is also a critical component to mission success. He stated that he believed that he could contribute materially if he is allowed to go ashore with his men. General Barton reluctantly approved the request, stating that he did not expect Roosevelt to return alive. Now, the casualty rate was expected to be high for the first wave of soldiers hitting the beach. And consider this, most of the soldiers hitting the beaches that day were in their early to mid-20s and in good fighting shape. General Roosevelt, by contrast, was 56 years old and had been battling health problems that included arthritis because of injuries he sustained during World War I. And to top it off, he had a bad heart, which he kept hidden from Army doctors. Ultimately, he would be the oldest man in the invasion and not in the best of shape. And not only the oldest man to hit the beaches, he was one of the first along with Captain Leonard T. Schroeder Jr. Now, in battle, things rarely go as planned, and that was certainly the case for General Roosevelt and the men of the 8th Infantry and 70th Tank Battalion. And shortly after landing on the beach, he was informed that they had drifted a mile south of their objective. Hey, just a minor inconvenience, right? With the aid of a cane and holding a 1911 pistol, Roosevelt personally made a reconnaissance of the area and located the causeways that were going to be used to advance inland off the beach. Opting to begin fighting from where they were instead of moving to their planned positions, he contacted the 2 battalion commanders and stated, quote, "We'll start the war from here." Now, picture a traffic cop in New York City during rush hour, trying to direct traffic. It's a chaotic scene with drivers heading in all different directions, blowing their horns, all kinds of stressed out from a long day at work. Can you imagine being that cop? Okay, now imagine people are shooting at you. That's only a small hint for what it must have been like for General Roosevelt. With bullets whizzing by and artillery landing all around him, General Roosevelt, with complete disregard for his own safety, personally welcomed each regiment as it landed on the beach. And by all reports, he was cool, calm, and collected, and seemingly unaffected by enemy fire. He inspired all with humor and confidence as he directed each regiment to its new objective. And like our New York City traffic cop, Roosevelt untangled traffic jams of trucks and tanks struggling to make their way onto the beach. One soldier later said that the general gave him courage to keep moving forward and complete the objective, stating that because of Roosevelt's demeanor and actions, it couldn't be all that bad. Roosevelt's quick thinking under fire and the modifying of the division's original plans enabled the troops to achieve their mission objectives, despite being a mile off course when they landed. Years later, Omar Bradley was asked what he thought the single most heroic action he had ever seen in combat. His answer: Ted Roosevelt on Utah Beach. For his actions on the morning of June 6, 1944, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation in part read, "His valor, courage, and persistence in the very front of the attack and his complete unconcern at being under heavy fire inspired the troops to heights of enthusiasm and self-sacrifice." Although the enemy had the beach under constant direct fire, Brigadier General Roosevelt moved from one locality to another, rallying men around him, directed and personally led them against the enemy. Under his seasoned, precise, calm, and unfaltering leadership, assault troops reduced beach strong points and rapidly moved inland with minimal casualties. He thus contributed substantially to the successful establishment of the beachhead in France. Sadly, the honor was given posthumously, because on July 12th, a little over a month from the D-Day invasion, he died of a heart attack. He was 56 years of age. General Roosevelt was buried in France. Among his pallbearers were General Omar Bradley and General George S. Patton. His body was eventually moved to the American Cemetery in Normandy. His brother, Second Lieutenant Quentin Roosevelt, who was killed in action in France during the First World War, was initially buried near the spot where his plane was shot down. But in 1955, his body was moved to the cemetery in Normandy next to his brother. He is the only World War I vet buried there. Another interesting fact is that General Roosevelt's son, Quentin Roosevelt, a captain in the Army, landed with the first wave on Omaha Beach. It makes the two Roosevelts the only two father and son to serve together on D-Day. And General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was a hard-charging leader who deeply cared for his men. His commitment to them reflected in their commitment to get the job done at any cost. It's similar to another hard-charging World War II leader of men, Marine Corps Colonel Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. The stories of his service and of the unit he led in the South Pacific seem like something out of the imagination of a Hollywood writer, but they are anything but fantasy. He flew with the Flying Tigers and then led one of the most legendary units of the war, the Black Sheep Squadron. He would become an ace with 20 confirmed kills, earn the Medal of Honor, and survive as a POW in Japan. To hear his story and the fantastic tales of the Black Sheep Squadron, click the screen now. And until next time, I'm Dennis Gill for Revealing History.